Well, hello everyone. Welcome again to MEI's flagship series 101. Thank you for joining us today. Today is the 9th lecture in the series. My name is Tatiana, and it's my pleasure to welcome not only you today, but also our guest speaker, Dr. Alanud Al-Sharik. Now, today we're going to be talking about the role of women and youth in driving change in the Middle East. Many Middle East countries are undertaking an ambitious process of economic transformation, where they're trying to reduce economic dependence on oil and gas and seeking alternate engines of growth. Aside from pursuing economic reforms and diversifying their economies, they are focusing on educating the young and empowering women. The Middle East is a very young region. Those between the ages of 15 to 35 make up something like around 34% of the region's population. But it also has very high rates of unemployment and underemployment of youth, especially for women, young women. For the Middle East region, the intersection of economic and social challenges and difficulties with regional stability and global instability is a potent intersection. All of us will have to adapt to a low-carbon future, but the Middle East faces sharper problems than most regions in surmounting this disruption, as it needs to diversify and find alternate sources of growth and upliftment for its populations. So how will governments in the Middle East manage their youth populations? Since 2011, youth now have access to more information, yet many of the wider political and socio-economic factors that contributed to the Arab Spring endure. Will governments change their responses to the challenges and opportunities of youth, and if so, how? We also see the role of women changing as well, at least in some Gulf states. Is this trend sustainable? And in the long term, what will be the political, economic, and social implications of this erosion of patriarchy? Now, here to help us make sense of these issues and more is Dr. Alanud Al-Sharik. Dr. Al-Sharik is the director of IPCA Strategic Consultancy and an associate fellow at Chatham House's Middle East and North Africa program and the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, D.C. She has held senior consultative and teaching positions in academic, governmental, and non-governmental institutions in the Arabian Gulf and abroad. Dr. Al-Sharik holds a BA from King's College London and a master's and PhD from the School of Oriental and African Studies. Her publications include books such as The Gulf Family and Popular and Political Cultures of the Arabian Gulf States. In recognition of her work to improve gender equality in the Middle East, she was awarded the Knighthood of the National Order of Merit by the French government in 2016 and was also named one of the BBC's 100 Women of 2019, a list of the most inspiring and influential women from around the world. I'm very glad to have Dr. Alanud with us, and I'm really looking forward to what she has to say today. Dr. Alanud will speak first, and she will give us a broad sketch of the topic. I'll follow with some questions, and we can use those to maybe delve a bit deeper into the issues or get some details. After which we'll open up things to questions from the audience. We're also taking written questions, so you can send those in via the chat function addressed to either myself or the events team. I'd like to invite those watching and listening in to please feel free to send in your questions at any time during this event. So over to you, Dr. Alanud. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Tatiana. Thank you for this encompassing introduction, both to myself and to the issues we will be discussing today, looking at youth and gender and their intersections in the Middle East, but more specifically, I'd like to speak today about the Arab states in the Middle East. So,
Sorry, are you sharing your screen at the moment? Your screen doesn't...
No, I will start sharing it in a minute.
All right, okay.
The question of youth is an interesting one. It's one that the world is grappling with at the moment. I'm a task force leader in the T20 right now on youth and migration, and there's a lot of conversations today on who are youth, what are the age groups, and why is the transition from youth to adulthood being delayed. We see this in a lot of places in the world. It's being delayed because of structural reasons, political reasons, social reasons, but also because of, I think, the choices that the youth themselves are making. And the Arab states are not immune to this global transition in terms of definitions of youth and youth expectations. If we wanted to take a closer look at what that means for youth and especially young women, because I think when we speak about youth collectively, we forget that for a lot of people, the experience of young women as a part of youth is similar, but it also presents its own challenges and its own needs. So Tatiana had started us off with the idea of labor and labor issues in the Arab Middle East. She said that unemployment is problematic in the Middle East and North Africa region, and it has been problematic for the past 25 years. So when we look at the issues that came up during the Arab Spring, we can see that they have their roots in economic issues. And I argue this in a paper that I wrote in 2011, looking at reform and rebirth in the Middle East and positioning the Arab Spring, let's say, revolutions as starting from an economic perspective, a perspective that sees the struggle of governments to remove subsidies and seeing them failing to provide jobs and security for a lot of their population, especially the youth. So if we frame this as the starting point in our conversation, we see that this unemployment is especially acute among young women. And it's problematic for both young men and young women because it delays the transition in terms of what can they do when they're facing three main issues. Weakness in the education system. The education system is not providing them with the tools necessary to enter into the workforce. And then there's a mismatch between the labor demands and what they are being offered in terms of vocational training, degrees, etc. And I think more importantly, the expectation of many young people in terms of wages, in terms of positions, in terms of the reality of low-level entry positions and what they feel like they need to reach. And women in this part of the world, they suffer from social discrimination built on, as Tatiana said, patriarchal practices, but also exclusion and discrimination that's really tied into two ideas: the idea of guardianship over women and women's bodies, and the idea that since there are so few jobs, the priority should go to men because they're entrusted with provision, and women's place is in the home, it's in the domestic sphere. So if we think of what this means in terms of people who are between, a transitional phase between childhood and adulthood, then we see that for the Arab states, the number is not actually around 30%. It could go up to almost 60%. And this intensifies the burdens on Arab states to provide jobs, to provide real solutions, to find ways to integrate women within the economy. And it becomes magnified when there's political instability and there's revolts against authoritarian regimes. So if I may start sharing, why do we need a new approach? Because what's been happening so far in terms of top down hasn't been enough in resolving these issues. If we look at the numbers, we find that, for example, the Arab Youth Survey shows that half of Arab youth are considering immigrating from the region. And of course, you have areas where there is civil unrest and prolonged economic stagnation, like Lebanon, leading those numbers. and other areas where perhaps the quality of life is better, they're less than those numbers. And the idea is that a solution is not going to come from top down, is very clear in feelings towards corruption within these nations. So 77% of Arab youth complain about corruption in their own country. So we can see that there's a trust crisis between youth and their governments. And we find that the satisfaction gap between the Arab states shows that there are less of these problems in the Gulf cooperation countries, but that's because the quality of life is higher in these richer states. And I'm going to take a closer look at what that means in terms of these challenges. So youth are now in a kind of a confrontational position with their governments. They strongly suspect them of corruption. They don't feel like they have a future there. So a very high percentage of them feels like immigration is the only solution. And this can be broken into another set of challenges and taboos to do with gender and gender roles and prescribed gender roles and the role of women within a patriarchy, but also there's no room for open sexual self-expression outside of the prescribed gender roles. And then there are issues with the ruling establishment itself. This manifests not only in corruption, but in terms of expectations of greater power sharing. Now that the youth have access to platforms and technologies that encourage more transparency, they have higher expectations. They're used to having a platform where their opinion matters. And this is kind of a novel idea in a lot of parts of the Arab world, where it's more of an kind of an autocratic system, and the people are more passive participants than active participants in the process. Religion dominates conservative societies such as the Arab states, and these can also lead to pockets of ethnic discrimination, especially when there's a nationalistic language growing. And all of this leads to, I would say, a struggle between an inherited culture that places a male figurehead above a pyramid of hierarchies, and the young and women come near the bottom of this pyramid of hierarchies, pyramid of obedience, we can call it in this way, and between a disruptive youth culture that now has aspirations and ambitions and tools, and sees that this inherited traditional model has not led to the greatest political stability or economic opportunity or social justice. So this is where the challenge comes in. And then you have interesting ideas coming out of research. So I read this quote that the UAE represents a kind of universal myth for young Arabs. They see an Arab state which appears to have bridged the divide between modernity and a familiar Arab and Muslim identity. So do we take this to be the ideal state that Arab youth wish to see replicated in their own countries? The UAE also has a very woman-forward strategy that it's pushing top down from the government. They've initiated a rule very recently that guarantees equal pay for men and women in the private sector. They have quotas, a 50% quota in their federal council for women. They have a quota of, I think, about 30% in their governmental jobs. So, and they have 9 female ministers, and the head of the Federal National Council is a woman. So this model of we are Muslim and Arab, but also modern, and we can be conservative in the way we dress and in our social traditions, but we can adopt more liberal attitudes towards women in the labor market and towards the different ethnicities and nations that can come and live and work in the UAE. So this presents an interesting idea for us. Of course, like other Arab states, there are limits to political and social expression in the UAE. So where does this figure into Arab youth aspirations remains a question to be delved into. So what has happened with gaining access to social media and to different narratives of not only current self-identity, but historical self-identity? And these are two pictures that I'm presenting to you from my country, Kuwait. The black and white one is was taken in the 60s, and the colored one was taken a few years ago. And they show that actually, when we look at the way that women used to dress, or the social expectations in the past, or let's say the general social tolerance for what makes up a good national woman can be very different. So when we are told that this is the way women traditionally dressed, or this is the way our mothers dressed in the past, now it is easy to share archival images from the past that challenge these narratives. And this is not just when it comes to the situation of women, but it comes to the multiplicity of cultural narratives that exist and that may be controlled by the homogeneous national identity narrative of states. So the question of rewriting history and looking at oppositional narratives to the ones pushed by the state is something that is really taking place in the virtual space, as well as in academic writings in the Arab world. And it's really fueling a lot of debates around youth and women. So when we look at what the Arab Barometer has to say about women, one of the things that comes up, especially when we look at some of the work that was done during COVID, while a lot of women and a lot of people around the world had to move online. In the Arab world, there's limits on public debates offline, so the public debates happen in a lot of countries mainly online. But with COVID, this became a universal reality. Work and everything related to political debates, etc., had to go online. And one of the things that stuck out to me was, they say that Arab women face multiple layers of invisibility, marginalization, and inequality. And I would add to that it's reflected in the low percentage of women in leadership positions across the Arab world. It's much lower than the global average. And I would say that it is also intertwined with the issues that are swept under the rug because of shame, and because they're seen to be family oriented, such as domestic violence and honor killings and honor crimes, and the issue of sexual harassment. And this is something that the different Arab states have grappled with, some of them very openly, in protests that are even taking place right now. Egypt lately has gone through this issue of sexual harassment and needing better laws. And then in other places, you will not find this being discussed at all for reasons of propriety, or because there is no kind of appetite to open this kind of worms and then have to go into further issues to do with policing the way men behave towards women. So a lot of this activism is taking place in an online sphere. So we have political protests online, and of course a lot of the what they call electronic crime laws shifted after the Arab Spring to control this space. But also it's a place where people can socially experiment with their movements. Civil societies would test an idea out on the online space and see if there's an appetite for it before taking it offline and trying to implement it in reality. We saw a lot of gender activism take place online. And with that, of course, comes a lot of gender trolling. And we saw citizen journalism happen at amazing rates in the Arab world, because we have especially in the Gulf, we have the highest penetration rates in the world, and also some of the most advanced networks, and a lot of people are early adopters and spend many hours online. But the flip side of that is, of course, that this creates silo effects online, and there is kind of a lack of moral accountability when people are naming and shaming, and it had severe consequences for many people during the Arab Spring, because there was naming and shaming campaigns taking place on Facebook, taking place in Twitter, and it led to arrests, and it led to the loss of livelihood for a lot of people. And so this idea of holding governments accountable is great, but the flip side of it is what we also saw develop with the electronic bots online and propaganda machines and creating online agendas to disseminate fake news and create issues or take sides in an issue. So this created another trust crisis online, which was a safe protest space for a while. Now it faces the same trust crisis. And here are some of the local reactions to what was happening around this time of really fiery political engagement right after the Arab Spring. And you can see the blue Twitter birds being shot down by somebody in a police uniform, and you can see a young man releasing these birds. So it really encapsulates the struggle between the younger generation and the more kind of conservative, wanting to control the narrative aspect of the establishment. So these are really the things that we have been left with, which is, how do you control hate speech online? If you give people freedom and if you want to make it an inclusive space, how do you control hate speech? Whether it's against women, and the burden of ambassadorship that every woman online has to not only represent herself, but she has to represent her family, and then her nation, and then all Arab women, and maybe all Muslim women as well. So it's layers of expectation. This is why there are much less women engaged online than men, at least with active and open real accounts, let's say. And then how do you protect yourself as an activist from being caught up within social media specific issues? And how do you control your identity between the self-censorship that young people in our part of the world have to, let's say, have to live under, because, as I said, they're not representing just themselves, that they represent a family and a tribe and maybe an area. So they're aware that their actions might have repercussions beyond themselves. And then how do you prevent young people from crossing electronic crime laws that are changing as new platforms emerge and new spaces for error or for revolution are created? So this is an example of a discussion that I've explored several times in some of my studies about co-opting the social media space, this struggle of authority between governments and between young people primarily, who you know, they do their own citizen journalism and they follow these influencers that can be, you know, our version of reality TV stars at time, and can command a lot of money for posts and sponsored posts. And they've been co-opted by some governments to fulfill, you know, a certain trajectory that they want young people to engage with. And this is an example for the Yemen war when it was first started. A very famous influencer was sent to cover it. And the coverage was much more intimate than the coverage that happens with traditional news media. So I want to close on this idea of the narrative and who controls it, and what has been happening right now. Why is it important that all these debates are happening online for both youth and women? Is that we've had these very entrenched, as I said, pyramids of hierarchies, and also halos around the men at the very top of the pyramid, whether they be from the religious establishment or from the ruling elites. And what has happened online over the past 8 or 10 years, is that these icons, as they've sort of come down to the level of the normal citizen online, which is the only place where citizens can access many of these figures and send them questions and interact with them, they've become demystified as they overshare, and ultimately everybody online overshares, and the people around them overshare. So for the first time, the lavish lifestyles are exposed, the way they are with their children is exposed. So when you have a religious scholar, for example, urging young men to go on the jihad, and then in the same breath congratulating his son for getting a very prestigious degree from an Ivy League university, you realize that there's two very different approaches to his household and to what he's urging young men from other households to do. And the same thing with the very kind of closed enclaves of ruling elites that now are being shared, their lifestyles, their private jets, their homes, and this is generating a very different conversation that I wager will continue as the real structural problems, especially economic structural problems, continue to occur in this part of the world, and the social contract between rulers and who they rule gets renegotiated, because now there's a lot of awareness, there's a lot of cross-state sharing, and as competition between states grows, they are more interested in revealing the wrongdoings of ruling elites, etc., in other states, and this has a knock-on effect. And how far does this online activity translate into mobilization offline? What we saw in the Arab Spring was it had a tremendous effect on mobilization offline. But after what I call the corrective measures that the Arab states took post-Arab Spring, offline activity has reduced a great deal, and when it happens at a great cost. And with COVID always threatening to keep us online, I think this is room for thought and further discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Alanut. That paves the way nicely for some of the questions that I have in mind. You mentioned the UAE at the start of your lecture, and I think we've all been trying to digest the results of the Arab Youth Survey that was released just recently. I found it very interesting that, I mean, when you talk about the Arab Youth Survey results, you have to also be very aware of the regional differences across the region. The experience and the outlook of someone in Lebanon are not necessarily the same as someone in, let's say, the UAE. And it struck me that, even though the headline was that nearly half, or was it, of Arab youth want to emigrate. When you break down the figures, the figure in the UAE is actually way lower than the figure in, let's say, that Lebanon or Iraq. And it got me thinking. I mean, the UAE has, for the 9th year or something, retained its place as the destination that Arab youth most want to go, and eating out US, Japan, and Europe. So I kind of wanted to tease out this idea of what it means to be like a model. I'm not quite sure of that. I mean, based on such vastly different economic, population differences, I mean, political systems, monarchies versus democracies. Do you think it's possible to have a model for something, or is it that the contexts are just too different to sort of square that?
I think that both systems present their own problematic repercussions for citizens, but what the monarchies have managed to do, at least during the Arab Spring, was find a way to stay ahead of the curve, whether that way was financial or by seeming to enter into concessions and open dialogue with their citizens much faster than republics did. And that might be part of the model of a surviving monarchy, this ability to move quickly. But of course, in terms of the Arab Gulf states, it was also the fact that they could provide financial solutions to a lot of the issues that came up. The UAE itself, the quote that I discussed is this aspirational model because of, I believe, the idea of economic prosperity. So it's a place where people feel that irrespective of their background or their ethnicity or their religion, they can prove themselves and apply themselves, and then have social and economic mobility. So there's not a kind of a very real ceiling on how far they can go up. As I said, in terms of maybe political expression, there isn't that big of a bandwidth. But it doesn't seem to be a deterrent for a lot of people, because the quality of life is quite good. There's a kind of tolerance for individual freedoms up to a certain extent. And for many Arab youth from other Arab states, it is comforting that it has an Arab identity, that it has a Muslim identity, but so it's not that far away from their value system, but it presents some of the same opportunities that they feel they could have in Europe.
Thanks. If just to the audience, I mean, if you have any questions to ask, do send it in. Moving on. Okay, so I mean, a great sort of kind of theme setter, I guess, is tapping on your own lived experience as a young Arab woman, and I mean, working on gender issues, following developments over the past decade or so. What are the biggest challenges facing young Arab women in the region today? I mean, what are the sources of reform and resistance to this gender equality?
I think that across the Arab world, there is some uniformity in the structural obstacles facing women, and especially young women. And that, as I said before, is tied into to the idea of gendered guardianship, and that men have a traditional position as providers, and therefore they are the head of the family, and they are the ultimate decision makers. So there's this underlying idea of obedience, and it's an idea that's entrenched in religious texts, and it's in the translations and interpretations of religious texts, and in the way that most tribal hierarchies work, in that the members of the tribe, they have to kind of follow what the head of the tribe says, and then there's the tribes and their heads, they follow what the head of the state says. And even in urbanized settings where this tribal system doesn't exist, it manifests itself in a very strict organizational hierarchy that puts certain ethnic and religious groups above others, and then men above women, and then elders above the youth, etc. So finding a way out of this hierarchy is very difficult, because there are expectations of traditional femininity, that your role, your ultimate role, is to be a mother and to be at home and to be provider of domestic services within that home, and anything other than that is either an aberration or accepted within certain fields. So I remember a conversation where Arab women from different states were saying that there's a generalized acceptance for women in positions as teachers and as jobs that don't have them interact with men a lot. Now, there has been amazing strides happening in countries such as Tunisia 50 years ago even. And the position of women within the political system is very different from places that have just started to integrate mobility for women and women's rights, etc. However, the idea that women can access the networks of power and the gateway positions that lead to leadership is a very different reality for them than it is for men. Men have a lot easier access to the platforms that, for example, lead you to become a board member, the head of a sport club, involved in municipality affairs, and all of this translates into leadership position later on. And women are held back from those in the most part. So what they need is a male patron. So you have a male figurehead paving the way for women, and this is why they haven't been able to achieve the numbers in leadership, or even the entrance into the labor market that they really need to for economic and political progression, as well as social justice, and the issues that we spoke about, that domestic violence is still treated as a private affair, even when there are legislations. Kuwait just passed the legislation criminalizing domestic violence 2 months ago, and you have also problems to do with the ideas of honor killing, that men who commit a murder against their female kin, it has different justifications in some countries than any other murder would be treated at. So these ideas and the fear of reputation and shaming and being exposed to sexual harassment, etc. This all contributes to holding women back.
I guess you need the political will to put in place the top-down change, and trying to pass things like legislation and the appropriate laws. But at the same time, you also need the collective sort of acceptance from society in order to get to achieve gender equality that is truly sustainable. And I guess this entails changing mentalities and uprooting effects of the kind of gendered tribalism and sectarianism. And not only that, religion also looms very large in the Middle East. This idea of giving women more rights is not accepted by a lot of scholars and Islamists, because it's regarded as a Western idea that will get women out of the house, and the family values will be destroyed. And it's hard when you have men both in positions of religious leadership but also political leadership. So there's a need to convince them to go along with all these changes, for these changes to actually mean something and be implemented. How do you do that? It's reach out and try and take them in to convince them. What have you found most effective in dealing with this obstacle, particularly in a religious context, to bring men along on this?
Well, you can't change the position of women without having men along. Male allies and political will that comes from men in powerful positions is the way that the situation of women has changed. I'm not suggesting that the only way to change is a top-down approach. I think it's really important to have thriving civil societies that focus on issues that may be neglected, and it's where the top-down meets the grassroots that really you have, as you said, a change in attitudes, in cultural approaches, etc. But also, I think that there is real economic incentive in governments right now to be more gender inclusive, and we've seen it manifest. And as young women themselves become more aware and more educated, those who are lucky enough to live above poverty lines, and those who are lucky enough not to be in conflict zones, and unfortunately that is a reality for a lot of young people and young women within the Arab states, then you have them basically breaking through non-traditional barriers. So when you have women in the judiciary, when you have women occupying security positions within the states, in the police and in the army, etc., when you have women occupying finance, ministerial positions, interior, security, ministerial positions, defense, etc., and you've seen these things happening more recently, and you've seen it's now become kind of a criteria for credibility to have women in leadership positions. Whether this actually translates into agency for women themselves outside of the ruling system, or if it's confined to those that the ruling system sees as conforming to their agenda, therefore worthy of inclusion in leadership positions, this remains to be seen. But the religious establishment is also not autonomous. So the religious establishment in each country is really influenced by the, let's say, the trajectory of the government itself and their agenda and what they want in terms of interpretations of holy texts and fatwas to do with women, since your question is specifically about women. And we've seen that happen. So in 2005, when the Kuwaiti government got serious about including women in the political field, it was accompanied by religious fatwas, local and more broadly from authority figures within the Arab and Islamic world. So there is that, and there's also the fact that the religious icons have become demystified. The Arab Spring put a lot of them in an uncomfortable position where they were Islamic youth and Islamic parties vying for change, and there was pressure on established Islamic scholars within the system to come up with pro-regime fatwas that kind of urged against disobedience and urged against fitna, which means strife or protest. So, so their position and their, you know, let's say their ability to be the objective religious authority has come into question since then. And the multiplicity of give and take narratives that no one can really control online has also, I think, contributed to shifting that. So how do you change hearts and minds? You do it through cultural exchanges, through talks, and through an economic and political reality that women have to be part of the solution. Therefore, we have to legislate ways to include them, whether that means representational quotas or removing all the laws that disempower them, or finding action plans that will remove the main dangers to women, the better maternity and paternity practices, etc., that will make their entrance into the labor market and into leadership and policy-making positions much easier.
Thanks. There was an article, I mean, there have been reports that although laws in Saudi Arabia have changed with regards to, more women at work, the biggest stumbling block has actually been their own families. Fathers and others are simply against such moves. How do you suppose this will play out? And I mean, what do you think the repercussions might be down the road if more women insist on their rights?
Well, I mean, speaking specifically about Saudi Arabia, here's an interesting idea for us to think about, Tatiana. So a short while ago, maybe less than 2 years ago, a woman needed her guardian's permission to leave the state. She needed her guardian's permission for a lot of things, but also a few years ago, mobility was an issue because women weren't allowed to drive. And then we get a law passed in Saudi Arabia, and which is considered quite progressive for the conservative region of the Arabian Gulf, that a woman can rent a place or stay in a place without needing a male guardian or a male muhram. So not only does she have mobility to drive and travel, but she can also live alone without needing the permission or the actual physical presence of a male protector, a muhram, which used to be one of the criteria to allow women to study abroad on university scholarships. And what this means is now we not only have large numbers of young Saudi women accepting jobs in different sectors, whether their families or conservative upbringing is accepting of that or not, but they're also accepting jobs in different cities within the kingdom. So they are traveling to the capital, or they're traveling to a big hub on the eastern province, or or in the south of the kingdom, living by themselves and working by themselves and covered by a law that was passed. So the transformation is very rapid, and it's understandable that families are going to take some time to internally process this giant leap of a much more permissive gender environment than what was in place not 10 or 20 or 50 years ago, but even 2 years ago.
Thanks. I want to pick up on one of the questions you left with us at the end of your presentation, on whether activity online translates into mobilization offline. Because on one hand, we've seen how virtual spaces have really been, the great equalizer in providing opportunities for mobilization and inclusion. But on the other hand, and I mean, we've seen this in the developed West. I mean, these devices can actually be quite demobilizing. This new sphere can, reduce the prospects of effective political action by allowing a safe outlet for people's frustrations and diverting energies away from actually actually taking concrete action to mobilize politically. What's your sense of this? Is it just a blind technological optimism to presume that, becoming increasingly connected to the internet and connected to the world would make Arab youth more politically aware and even more active?
Well, it can't be a myth, because they are more politically aware and they are more politically active online. Now, how much of this online activism or clicking to support and liking to show that you approve of something, how much of it is going to affect policy change or is going to translate into movements on the street? That's an inexact science. I'm sure somebody's going to come up with an algorithm very soon for us to be able to figure that out precisely. But I'll tell you this: at least in this part of the Arab world, people are able to put pressure on the government, maybe in a small way, but in a way that's disruptive enough for governments to legislate control over that space, just by releasing a hashtag. The hashtag may not be Me Too. For example, the Me Too movement really had amazing effects in the West, but it didn't really take off in the same way in this part of the world. But other hashtags can be really influential and can be embarrassing, and they cause an impetus for governments to do things. And we have seen this increasingly happen. Many times this has been used by ruling regimes, either to capitalize, like we have resolved this problem, hoping that the masses will then retweet, or in really trying to shut it down at the source and make it illegal to speak about these topics online. For example, during the Gulf crisis, it sometimes became problematic to speak positively about Qatar in some states. It would cause legal complications, and so this type of thing leads you to believe that yes, people are more politically aware online, and this awareness comes with its own powers, and governments care about that, because governments before were either unable to have a direct dialogue with the youth, or they didn't need to worry about what the youth thought, because there was no international platform watching but now this has changed, and I think changed forever.
Thank you. I think my colleague Feng Chin has a question. Feng Chin, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, thanks so much for your very interesting presentation. I enjoyed it a lot. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate for us, what are differences in terms of challenges that women face in places like, say, Egypt and Lebanon versus the Gulf states comparatively? And how have these changed before the Arab Spring and after the Arab Spring? Thanks so much.
Well, I think I'm gonna need a whole other lecture just to go into that, but I'm gonna try to point out two major differences. In Lebanon and in Egypt, there's of course the economic component. The Arab Gulf states, especially if we're talking in terms of nationals and not just all women, because there's huge expat communities in the Gulf states, and many of them are women. But just in terms of nationals, the Arab Gulf states, for the most part, have generous subsidies for their nationals, and it's a rentier model that provides a lot of the essential services, so the citizens don't have to pay for them, and they guarantee education. Some of them guarantee jobs, housing, etc. So there are a lot of things that Gulf nationals up to this point in our history did not really have to worry about too much. But of course, there is disparity even between the Arab states in those terms. And so this also impacted women, because women in the Arab Gulf states, because of the financial incentive, a lot of them have domestic staff to help with the house, so they are able to join the labor market. They're able to contribute in a very different way than women in places where they have to be the primary caregivers for their children, and places where kind of political activity, civil society, and engagement happened at a much earlier stage, such as Lebanon and Egypt, where there was a direct interaction between citizens and colonial forces. And there was a national independent movement to get rid of these colonial forces that forced women out of their homes and onto the streets, and forced the newly independent state to grapple with women being outside the house and having an active political role, as well as a labor market role. They have progressed and dealt with issues that are still to be examined in the Gulf states and still to be resolved. But that is also different in each state that you go to, and also the fact that in both Lebanon and Egypt you have Christian minorities, which don't really indigenous Christian minorities. They're nationals from the country itself, where you don't really have that in the Arab Gulf states. They're more uniform, at least in terms of being Muslim, in terms of the national population for the most part. So you have an ideology that is common between all three countries in the Arab world in terms of traditional woman's role and what makes a good Arab woman, but the states have dealt with it due to their own political reality and economic reality and their historical interactions post-colonialism. For example, in the work that we do in trying to abolish Article 153, the honor killing article in Kuwait, we relied on the work of activists in Lebanon that had engaged with this issue much earlier. And Lebanon is one of the few Arab states that has abolished this law quite recently. So just in terms of numbers and historical weight, cultural weight, etc., Egypt had a centralized position within the Arab world for many, many years, and that also affects the status of Egyptian women, for example.
Thanks so much.
Oh, I don't see any questions. We will just ask you another question. There's been much discussion about the so-called youth vouch. I mean, depending on who you talk to, this is either an asset or, like a flashing warning sign. Can you speak about the aspirations of youth, whether these are being met, and is this perhaps a potential powder keg? One thing that, I mean, in our conversations with experts, one thing that is frequently spoken about is this fear that the current generation is going to be the first to not do better than their parents, for instance.
I tend to shy away from this crystal ball gazing when it comes to try to imagine what's going to happen. But is it a good thing to have a youth bulge? It can be in terms of having a generation that will be able to enter the workforce and be able to provide let's say income for the state, etc. But how prepared are they, and in what ways have you made them contributors to a world economy? Because now it's no longer enough for you to have youth that are contributing to their own economies. They have to be viable within a universal context, especially as we move more and more online. Are we there in the Arab world? No. In terms of AI engineers, software engineers, and people who really have skill sets that are in demand in a global market, we're not there. And our youth are involved in identity politics, unfortunately, and conflict zones. And this will continue to manifest itself as long as there are politicians and political regimes that have invested in prolonging this status quo for their own reasons. So what will happen when these young people don't have a job market to enter? And this is not a hypothetical, this is the reality. In places like Palestine, unemployment is, I think, 40%, if not higher. And the only place where unemployment isn't an issue, I think, according to the report that we both quoted, is Qatar, where the country can afford to engage youth in positions within the government. So what happens when you have politically charged young people who don't have an entrance into the job market and who cannot imagine a future for themselves within their countries, who want to immigrate and who don't trust their governments? And as Europe shuts down more and more of the migration pathways, they're stuck in their own countries. And where is that anger and frustration going to be positioned? And as I said, we saw the first wave of the Arab Spring being ignited by mostly dissatisfaction to do with economic issues, and in other places to do with resolving the issue of political representation. Right before the COVID-19 crisis hit, we saw deep political unrest in Iraq and in Lebanon. People took to the streets because the corruption had made life untenable and unsafe anymore, and young people were not having it. But the flip side of that, Tatiana, is what can they do? Even if they take to the streets, how much can young people really influence in terms of change? And this hadn't been answered in Lebanon or in Iraq. They took to the streets, there were crackdowns, they were brought back in. The people who were in power remain in power to this day, even after multiple mismanagement and huge problems like the port explosion in Lebanon. So this tension, I don't see it being resolved anytime soon. And I foresee an unfortunately bumpy ride ahead of us, at least in the short term.
Thank you for that, Dr. Alanur. My colleague Asif Shuja, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute, has a question. Asif, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Tatiana. My question actually is taking back to my university. Whenever topics were being selected for thesis, my observation for so many years has been that it would be only a woman who would choose women and gender issues. I have never seen a man, taking up that topic. I think since our honored guest is such a changer, in society, so I think maybe there is one point where we can work to make some changes. And at a broader level, there are one more change that I could suggest, because she's quite equipped to do that. If we could replace the term feminist by egalitarianism, because feminist is like, again, proposing egalitarianism, but if we choose a different term, it has different implications. So these are two suggestions. One question to my guest is, going by the theory of large letters of Aristotle, can we have a little focus on the United States? Why has United States never been able to produce a woman president? We know that most of the prophets are male, but why is it happening in the United States? Thank you so much.
Yani, I like this exchange. Thank you so much. And the term feminist is something that many women also don't feel comfortable with. I don't know, but was it egalitarian that you suggested? I think a lot of women on the other side that celebrate and love the term feminist will see egalitarian as just another way to erase women from the equation, that they're not even allowed to be feminists and stand for women and for the systematic discrimination against women. But I think a rose by any name is still as sweet as Shakespeare says, so it doesn't matter what we are called, as long as we can improve the situation for the weakest and most vulnerable among us. And for the most part, they're young women.
Asif, does that answer your question?
Part of it has been answered. If I do not insist, but I will just remind you about the American society, because it has been a great proponent of democracy, political freedom. Why doesn't it talk about women empowerment? Because it has great power, to bring out those changes in the Middle East. Why doesn't it talk about it? Does it have to do something with its own inherent social weakness, where it has not been able to produce? Just in the positive way, it could also bring out some changes. Sorry for intervening again. Thank you.
No, that's fine. Well, I'm not an American, but I can have an opinion about it. And I would say that the US doesn't have quotas for women, which is when you see countries with a lot of representational politics to do with women, you find that there are much more women in leadership positions, and the US doesn't have those quotas, so it is much harder for women to make it to leadership positions. Also, this is a universal problem: is that the lack of cognitive recognition of women as president, and this bias is inherent, and you find it everywhere, and it only changes when a woman actually makes it. So the shift not only happens when we have a woman make it, but it's a repetition of the process. So the UK had Margaret Thatcher, and then it took them 30 plus years to repeat it with Theresa May. India had Indira Gandhi, and we haven't seen a repeat of that. Pakistan had Benazir Bhutto, we still haven't seen
Most
a repeat
recently,
of that.
the COVID-19 pandemic had caused retail shops to shut.
Sorry, can you mute yourself? Sorry about that.
Was that a question, or was that a comment that COVID-19
No, I think someone unmuted herself accidentally.
Okay. Yeah. So the US has made interesting strides in terms of women in leadership. So when they introduced women as a foreign minister, they had 3 women in a row to normalize it. So I think we can't deny that the United States has huge numbers of its population who are conservative and who are traditional and who believe in traditional gender roles that don't see women as the head of the household, and therefore maybe that doesn't translate as the head of the United States. But certainly we've seen this change most recently in women running for Congress seats and making it there. Even women who look in ways that are non-traditional or non-white, or they look that they belong to a certain ethnicity that may not have a mainstream popularity such as others, but they are making it, and they're making it in greater numbers. So I expect if this trend continues, it won't be too long before we have a president that's a woman in the United States, especially if this aligns with the interest of the 2 major parties.
Okay, Asif, I think she's answered your question.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Alanud. Okay. You mentioned that one of your points was that the offline debates were hard. So once the social media sphere opened up, public debates moved online, and I wanted to get your take on how governments in the region have sort of dealt with this. How they've sort of how this is the government, how heavy is the government hand is what I'm saying. How visible, how heavy, how have they dealt with this with such public debates? I mean, you mentioned a public, I think a trust deficit, between the leadership and the youth, and this ties in with a sort of disconnect. And I think governments have tried to engage the youth more, and they've done this by going online. How has this affected online activism? This shadow of the government in the virtual sphere, and how has this affected how youth and activists conduct themselves online?
Well, the first way that this is manifested online is that overtly political discussions have decreased, and they've been replaced by either symbolic political discussions or limited to places that have a higher ceiling for what is acceptable in terms of criticisms of the government. And they've been co-opted by the government pushing certain influencers and promoting them, even across a specific region, who espouse the values that the government thinks youth should have. So people who focus on fashion or on tourism or on cooking, who have a kind of more of an entrepreneurial bent than a political one, they find it's much easier to get governmental sponsorship or to be put in the forefront as a role model for youth than those who engage in civil activism or political agitation, obviously. What has happened to the nature of the debate itself is that people have either found ways around it or experimented with ways around it, because sometimes even when they're being opaque and they allude to something instead of saying it directly, they will face legal consequences. And also by being, I think, desensitized to the urgency of political debates. So when political debates happened before the Arab Spring and during the Arab Spring, there was a sense of urgency and a sense of possibility, an outcome from all this action. But now you're online and you're not sure that you're dealing with a real person or a bot, or if your network has been infiltrated, or if this is actually worth the hassle, and it's going to lead to a jail sentence, or it's going to lead to other penalties. So I would say that the space for hope has diminished, and the space for ability to induce change and the appetite for confrontation with the government has gone down a great deal. On the other hand, the government has become a lot more aware of the need to engage with young people on their own terms, and that's why they've started to use social media a lot more. And we say now that your Twitter feed is your CV for young people in the region, and it's sad but true that they equate more followers with greater credibility, whether those followers are following you for entertainment or educational purposes, or because you are actually a role model. It doesn't seem to factor in it that much. It's just that if you have a lot of followers, then you have considerably more influence than somebody who may be an academic or a CEO or even a government figure who doesn't.
Okay, I see my colleague Feng Jin has another question. Feng Jin, you want to go ahead?
Thanks, Tati. So you mentioned earlier that religion and traditional attitudes have been sort of a barrier for women in the Arab world in trying to attain their rights and get a greater involvement in the economy. But depending on how you look at Islam, Islam can also be possibly a resource for feminists as well. I mean, we know that the Prophet's wife Khadija was a businesswoman. That he worked for her. Before Islam, women didn't inherit, and after Islam they did, although it was less than men. And Islam outlawed female infanticide, and it was Zainab, Hussein's brother, who sort of stood up for him, to the Caliph when Hussein was murdered. So I was just wondering, in the Arab world, have there been attempts to sort of make use of the potentialities of the Islamic tradition to make a feminist argument? Thanks so much.
Well, in the Arab world and beyond, there's a very big movement of Islamic feminism, and it also comes into play across regions where groups work to attack certain legislations to do with family law, marriage, etc., using Islamic texts. And they work across not just the Arab world, but across the Islamic world to try and push these legislations across all countries at the same time. using the tenets of Islamic feminism, finding alternatives in the holy text, finding examples like the ones you used in our history that would support a certain position. And I'll give you one example of this, which is child marriage. So child marriage is a very contentious issue because a lot of religious scholars would try to find justifications for it within the Islamic text, and then it becomes very difficult for legislators, even though they have signed child protection laws and they've signed on to CEDAW, and they have national and constitutional laws that protect children. It becomes very problematic for them to then go ahead and enforce it. And one of the ways that there's been pushback is through Islamic text, but then also other ways to tackle it, and perhaps more immediate and practical ways, is to find e-solutions for it. So, for example, if somebody is below a certain age, if a woman is below 18, then automatically the marriage certificate won't get issued online. So that's one way to kind of push back. And then another way is to enforce deep penalties for this type of behavior, or to rename it. I mean, you can call it child marriage, or you can call it pedophilia. And the way that you rename it has a lot of resonance within a society. And this tension then becomes between people who want to use religious texts as the only source of kind of codifying your social and legal contracts with others, and people who want secular laws that can pick and choose from the sacred texts, especially when it comes to issues like this, which are not only problematic in Arab states because of religion, but also are problematic within communities in the West and in the East that have religious interpretations that justify child marriage.
Thanks so much.
So we are fast approaching the hour-and-a-half mark, but maybe we don't have any other questions. But before I let you go, maybe Dr. Alanud, do you want to have the last word to maybe wrap up, or say a few words that you didn't manage to deal with earlier?
Well, I think that I just want to end with saying that although there's a lot to be cautious about, we don't have options besides optimism, because we live here, we work here, our children are here, and our futures are here. And I think there's a big space that has yet to be explored in terms of positive international engagement. And these types of conversations are a big part of that, where we talk about things as openly and as honestly as we can, and we try to build bridges so that we can benefit from each other's experiences, because the things that hold true and common to us, wanting a dignified life, wanting safe and healthy options for our children, and wanting a more equitable and promising future, they hold true wherever you are in the world. And I think COVID has brought to us the reality of how a decision made in one part of the world can have devastating repercussions economically, politically, socially, and in health terms across the world. So I thank you very much for hosting me today and giving me this platform to share some of my ideas. And I hope this leads to a more interested and nuanced engagement with my part of the world.
Thanks. There's also one question that just came in that I think might be a good end of. Jinga Elbel, apologies if I mispronounced your name. She said, what role can those of us outside the Middle East play to empower Arab youth and women in this time? I mean, if you don't mind, maybe we could take a shot at that, take a stab at that?
Well, I think we have, as humanity, we've established mechanisms for ensuring universal justice. Some of them, like CEDAW, for example, has been ratified by most of the Arab countries, if not all. I mean, going back to your colleague's question, the US, for example, hasn't ratified it. So that might be another reason why they're not putting these women forward laws into practices, although there are many amazing women groups in the US that are doing an amazing job of that by themselves. I think it remains our collective duty to make sure that certain things, like, for example, honor killing legislations, just get abolished wherever you are in the world. And if you make that a conversation, if you make that part of your engagement, this refusal that these laws that are dangerous and destructive are allowed to exist because somebody has found a religious or a traditional or a cultural cover for it, I think this is the best way to move things forward. And as I said before, holding more discussions like this, not just when you have an expert from my part of the world coming to speak, but also having people from different regions and certainly much more engagement from Asia, because we're geographically close, but I think culturally opaque to each other, and that needs to change.
Yeah, and I think it's also in the interest of the rest of the world, including us in East Asia, that the Middle East does succeed in making this transition. I recall someone saying that failure will bring consequences that are not just economic in nature. So I think there's clearly a lot at stake for the Middle East on this issue, on really being able to harness the region's youth and women as a positive sort of dividend for economic growth, prosperity. And after all, as the UAE Minister of State for Youth Affairs, I think herself, she's only 26, I think. She said that the leaders of the region have to view this segment of the population as an asset rather than a problem or an issue to be dealt with. I mean, yes, there are obviously some challenges, but it's encouraging in a sense because, I mean, it shows that, it is possible to catch up. And, basic truths of economic and social development, they remain unchanged, in terms of how you go about maximizing human capital, the human potential of every citizen. Yeah. Well, I mean, with that, I'm afraid we're out of time, but I wanted to thank Dr. Alanud for a really insightful discussion, great conversation, and to our audience for their questions. I mean, one advantage of this format is that I think we can reach people from everywhere, and I think we are very glad we're able to do that. We are approaching the end of our 101 series for this year. We have 2 more sessions to go. Please join us again next week for the second last installment, where we will turn our attention to religion and political Islam in the Middle East and its influence on identity and attitudes in our region. So have a good evening, everyone, and thank you once again, Dr. Alanud. I wish you a pleasant day.
Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.